I never used to believe in ghost stories, but what happened to me one night at my old school changed my mind. It was a few years ago, during my senior year of high school, and I was part of the yearbook committee. We often stayed late after school to meet our deadlines, which meant long nights in the eerily quiet building. One night, it was just me and two other committee members, John and Marcus, working late in the school's computer lab. The school had been built in the 1920s, and while it had its charm, the old brick walls and creaky floors made it feel a little spooky when you were there after hours. By now, though, we were used to it. We would joke about the creaking pipes and the flickering lights, chalking it up to the building's age. But that night, things felt different. It was around 10:30 p.m. when Marcus announced he was heading home. John and I were still tweaking the layout for the yearbook, so we stayed behind. The hallways outside the lab were pitch black, lit only by the dim glow of the emergency exit signs. We had been sitting in front of the computers for hours, and the hum of the machines and the tapping of the keyboard keys were the only sounds breaking the silence. As we worked, I suddenly heard a faint sound like distant footsteps echoing in the hallway. I paused and listened, but the sound stopped as quickly as it had started. John didn't seem to notice, so I shrugged it off and went back to work, convincing myself that it was probably just the janitor making his rounds. A few minutes later, the sound returned, this time louder and more distinct. It wasn't the usual slow, steady steps of someone cleaning the building. These footsteps were quicker, more deliberate, like someone was walking briskly down the hall. I looked over at John, who had finally noticed. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded. We both sat still, listening intently. The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the empty corridors. They seemed to be getting closer, but then they stopped again, just as abruptly as before. The silence that followed was suffocating. "We should check it out," Jun said, her voice shaky but determined. I wasn't sure if that was a good idea, but I didn't want to seem like a coward. So, we grabbed our phones for light and cautiously made our way to the hallway. The school was unnervingly quiet. The fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, casting unsettling shadows along the walls. As we moved down the hallway, our footsteps seemed deafening in the stillness. We reached the end of the hall, where the sound had seemed to come from, but found nothing. No janitor, no students, no sign of anyone at all. The doors to the classrooms were closed, and the lockers stood silent, like rows of forgotten sentinels. Jung let out a nervous laugh. "Maybe we're just tired," she said, trying to sound casual. I agreed, but there was an uneasy feeling in my gut that I couldn't shake. We turned to head back to the lab when something caught my eye, a flicker of movement at the far end of the hallway, near the old gym. It was just a shadow, barely noticeable, but it sent a chill down my spine. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Jean, who turned in the direction I was looking. She squinted, but whatever it was had disappeared. "Maybe it was nothing," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Reluctantly, we decided to check out the gym. The doors were heavy and creaked loudly as we pushed them open. Inside, the vast space was dark, except for the faint moonlight streaming through the high windows. The air was colder in here, and the silence felt more oppressive. We slowly walked across the gym floor, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the emptiness. There was no sign of movement, no sound at all until we heard the unmistakable creak of the bleachers shifting. We froze, hearts pounding. The bleachers were old, and they didn't move on their own. I shone my phone's flashlight toward the bleachers, half expecting to see someone sitting there, but there was no one. The rows of seats were completely empty. Jung grabbed my arm. "Let's go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted out of the gym, slamming the doors behind us. We raced back to the lab, grabbed our bags, and left the school as fast as we could. The whole way home, we didn't say a word, but I could tell we were both shaken by what had happened. The next day, we cautiously brought it up with Marcus, who looked at us with wide eyes. "You guys know about the gym, right?" he asked. Apparently, years ago, a student had died in the gym under mysterious circumstances. There were rumors of strange sightings, of footsteps echoing through the empty halls late at night. We had laughed at those stories before, but after that night, we weren't so quick to dismiss them. I've never stayed late at that school again. The building may be old, and the store. During my senior year of high school, our drama club decided to put on a production of a classic ghost story. The play was set in a historic mansion, and we were lucky enough to get access to our school's old, rarely used auditorium, which had a similar vintage feel. The auditorium was perfect for creating an authentic atmosphere, with its velvet curtains, creaky wooden floorboards, and dim lighting. We spent weeks preparing for the play, rehearsing late into the evening. One night, as we were finishing up a particularly intense rehearsal, the lighting in the auditorium flickered and then went out entirely. We were left in near complete darkness. My friends and I laughed nervously, assuming it was just a technical glitch. Our director, Mr. Thompson, was already on the phone with the maintenance crew. While we waited, we decided to use the time to practice our lines in the dim light of our phones. The atmosphere was oddly fitting for the ghost story we were rehearsing. The old auditorium seemed to take on a life of its own, the creaks and groans of the building amplifying the tension. As I was practicing my lines in one of the side wings, I heard a faint whispering. I initially thought it was one of my classmates messing around, but when I turned around, no one was there. I shrugged it off and continued rehearsing. The whispering continued intermittently, growing louder each time. It seemed to be coming from the backstage area, but when I went to check, I found nothing out of the ordinary. My friends were busy with their own lines, so I decided to ignore the whispers, attributing them to the building's age and acoustics. When the maintenance crew finally arrived and restored the lights, we continued our rehearsal with no further incidents. The rest of the week was relatively uneventful, though I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling I had experienced. I decided not to mention it to anyone, not wanting to seem overly superstitious. The night of the performance arrived, and the auditorium was packed. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The play went off without a hitch, and the audience was enthralled. After the final curtain call, we celebrated backstage, relieved and exhilarated. As we were cleaning up, I was alone in the auditorium. I decided to take a final look around, admiring the space that had been our home for the past few weeks. The old building was quiet now, and I felt a strange mix of nostalgia and unease. That's when I heard it again, the whispering. It was softer than before but unmistakable. I followed the sound, which seemed to be coming from the old, dusty piano in the corner of the stage. I approached the piano and noticed that the lid was slightly ajar, though I was certain I had closed it earlier. As I reached out to close the lid, the whispering stopped abruptly. I was about to turn away when I heard a soft, eerie melody begin to play. The piano keys moved on their own, producing a haunting tune that sent shivers down my spine. I stood frozen, unable to tear my eyes away. Just then, the door to the auditorium creaked open, and the lights flickered back on. My friends, having noticed my absence, came in to check on me. They found me standing by the piano, looking bewildered. "What's going on?" asked Sarah, her voice filled with concern. I started to say, but no words came out. I pointed to the piano, but the melody had stopped, and the keys were still. My friends didn't see anything unusual, and the piano was now silent. I told them about the whispering and the music, but they were skeptical. We decided to leave the auditorium and lock up for the night. As we walked out, I glanced back at the old building, still feeling a chill. We never experienced anything like that again, and the rest of our performances went off without incident. Still, the memory of the whispering and the ghostly piano music lingered in my mind. Looking back, I can't fully explain what happened that night. The auditorium's age and acoustics could have played tricks on my mind, but the experience felt too vivid to dismiss entirely. Despite the eerie encounter, I'm grateful that we all returned safely, and the performance was a success. Sometimes, it's the unexplained moments that stay with us the longest, leaving us to wonder if there's more to the stories we tell than we care to admit. It was a chilly October evening when I found myself alone at my high school, finishing up some last-minute work in the library. I was the only student left, having stayed late to prepare for an upcoming exam. The library was a grand, old building with high ceilings, long rows of dusty bookshelves, and dim lighting that made the place feel both majestic and eerie. By the time I finished, it was well past sunset, and the library was deserted. I packed up my things and headed for the exit, only to find that the front doors were locked. I'd forgotten to ask the janitor to let me out earlier. Annoyed but not panicked, I used my phone to call the school's main office. There was no answer. I decided to wait in the library until someone came to let me out. With nothing to do, I took a seat at one of the long study tables and tried to distract myself by reading a book I'd picked up from the shelves. The library was unusually quiet, the only sound being the occasional creak of the old building settling. After a while, I started to feel an unsettling presence, a feeling that I was being watched. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. Then, I heard a soft, shuffling sound coming from somewhere in the library. I looked up, expecting to see someone walking past, but the library was empty. I got up and checked the aisles, but there was no one there. The noise stopped as soon as I started looking, and I couldn't find any source for it. Feeling a bit unnerved, I returned to my table. I was about to resume reading when I noticed something strange. A book on the shelf nearest to me had been pulled slightly out of place. I walked over to straighten it, but as I did, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The air around the shelf seemed to shimmer, and I felt a sudden chill. I brushed it off as a draft and continued to wait. The shuffling sound returned, more persistent this time, and seemed to be coming from the upper floor of the library. I knew the library had an attic, but I was certain it was closed off. I ventured up the narrow, winding staircase to the second floor, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The second floor was just as empty as the first. The shuffling noise was louder now, coming from a door at the end of the hall that was marked as staff only. I approached the door cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was slightly ajar, and the shuffling sound grew more distinct. I pushed the door open and saw a dark, narrow staircase leading up to the attic. The sound was now unmistakably footsteps, though no one was in sight. I hesitated but then decided to investigate. The attic was dusty and cluttered with old furniture and boxes. The dim light from my flashlight revealed cobwebs and piles of old books. The footsteps had stopped, and the attic was eerily silent. I called out, but no one answered. I searched the room, but it was empty, except for the scattered belongings. Just as I was about to turn back, I noticed an old mirror propped against the wall. It was covered in dust, but something about it caught my attention. As I wiped away some of the grime, I saw a reflection that made me gasp. In the mirror, there was a shadowy figure standing behind me, its form indistinct and shrouded in darkness. I spun around, but the attic was empty. The figure was gone, my flashlight flickered, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. I felt a rush of cold air and decided it was best to get out of there. I hurried back down the stairs, my mind racing. I retraced my steps to the main floor, where the front doors were finally being unlocked by the janitor. I quickly explained the situation, though I could tell he was skeptical. The next day, I spoke to a few teachers and learned that the library had been the site of several strange occurrences over the years, including reports of ghostly sightings and unexplained noises. No one had ever been able to explain them, but the stories had become part of the library's lore. Though nothing truly harmful happened, the experience left me with a lingering sense of unease. The library remains one of the most haunted places in our school's history, and I often wonder if what I saw was a figment of my imagination or something far more sinister. Whatever it was, I was grateful that I made it out unscathed, leaving behind only questions and a chilling memory. It was a late autumn afternoon at my high school when I experienced something so unsettling that it still gives me chills. The school was old, built in the 1920s, with sprawling corridors and a few creaky, unlit corners. It was the kind of place that had its share of rumors about hauntings, but I had always dismissed them as just that rumors. It started on a Friday, during an after-school study session in the library. I was alone, working on a research paper, while my friends had left for their various extracurricular activities. The library was vast, with tall shelves of books and only a few scattered tables. The light from the tall windows was waning as the sun set, casting long shadows across the room. Around 5 p.m., as I was deeply engrossed in my work, I heard the faintest sound, a soft rustling, like someone flipping through pages. I looked around but saw no one. The library was silent except for the occasional creak of the old building. I shrugged it off as the settling of the building or maybe even the wind outside, though it felt strange given how quiet it had been. A few minutes later, the rustling sound came again, more distinct this time. I glanced toward the back of the library where the sound seemed to be coming from. There, in the dimmest part of the room, I saw a book on the floor, its cover turned toward me. I was sure it hadn't been there before. I stood up, walked over, and picked it up, noting that it was an old volume of poetry with a worn cover. I set the book back on the shelf and returned to my table, but the rustling continued intermittently. Each time I looked up, the library seemed to be unchanged, yet the feeling of being watched was growing. I tried to focus on my paper, but the sense of unease was palpable. Then, the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out entirely. The library plunged into darkness, leaving only the dim light filtering through the tall windows. My heart began to race, and I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight. As I turned on the screen, I noticed something even more disturbing. The shadow seemed to be moving on its own, despite there being no visible source for it. I stood still, the light from my phone casting eerie shapes on the walls. The shadow moved closer, and I could make out what appeared to be a figure tall, indistinct, and fading in and out of view. My pulse quickened, and I felt a cold sweat form on my brow. I tried to tell myself it was just an illusion or the result of my anxiety, but the shadow seemed to deliver it. To real. Just then, the lights flickered back on, and the shadow vanished. The library was as it had been before, no one else in sight, the book back on the shelf. I looked around, but there was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. I wanted to leave immediately but decided to finish up quickly and then get out of there. As I packed my things, I noticed a strange, cold breeze sweeping through the room, despite all the windows being closed. The rustling sound came once more, but this time it was accompanied by a low, almost inaudible whisper. It was like someone was speaking right behind me, but when I turned, there was no one there. I gathered my belongings and hurried out of the library, my heart pounding. The hallways were empty, and the building seemed eerily quiet. I rushed to the exit and left the school, feeling a mix of relief and lingering fear. The next Monday, I mentioned the strange occurrences to a few friends, who were intrigued but skeptical. When I spoke to a few teachers about it, they mentioned that there were indeed some old legends about the school being haunted, particularly the library. Some claimed that the shadows were a result of the building's old wiring and that the library had a history of peculiar incidents. I never experienced anything like that again, and I continued to attend school as usual. The library was as quiet and mundane as ever, but every now and then, when I pass by it, I can't help but recall that chilling experience. Despite knowing I was safe, the memory of the shadow and the whispers in the darkness remain with me, a reminder that sometimes the eeriest things are those we can't fully explain. It was a chilly October afternoon when I had to stay late at school to finish a group project. My friends had left hours ago, leaving me alone in the empty, echoing hallways of our old high school. The school had been around since the 1920s, and it had a reputation for being haunted, though I never put much stock in ghost stories. I was in the library, which was normally a quiet and comforting place, but that day, the silence felt oppressive. The tall, dusty shelves cast long shadows across the room, and the only sound was the soft clicking of my keyboard. The library was located in a separate wing of the school, far from the more frequently used classrooms. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the library's fluorescent lights flickered ominously. I brushed it off as a technical glitch and continued working. Suddenly, I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from behind me. I glanced around, but the room was empty except for me and the rows of old books. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. My first thought was that someone else had entered the library, but when I checked, the room was still empty. The tapping sound seemed to be coming from the far end of the library, near the old and used section. Curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to investigate. As I approached the source of the noise, I noticed something peculiar. The air seemed colder, and the tapping grew louder. It was as if someone or something was knocking rhythmically on one of the library's large, wooden shelves. My breath came out in visible puffs, and a shiver ran down my spine. I tried to convince myself it was just the old building settling or the sound of pipes, but the rhythmic nature of the tapping made it feel deliberate. I reached the end of the aisle and saw that the tapping was coming from a high shelf, but nothing was visible. The sound stopped suddenly, and the library fell into an eerie silence. I checked the shelf and the surrounding area, but found nothing amiss. Just as I was about to turn away, I noticed something even stranger. An old, leather-bound book had fallen to the floor. It wasn't a book I had seen before, and its cover was dusty and worn. I picked it up, feeling an odd heaviness in my hands. The book was marked with a peculiar symbol that I didn't recognize. Curious but cautious, I opened it to find a collection of handwritten notes and sketches. The notes were about the school's history and mentioned strange occurrences, disappearances of students, explained noises, and ghostly sightings. The sketches were crude, but they depicted figures that looked unsettlingly like shadowy apparitions. As I flipped through the pages, I noticed a particular entry that stood out, a description of a student who had vanished in the 1960s. The details matched an old legend about a student who had gone missing in the very library where I was now sitting. The temperature in the room dropped further, and I could see my breath. A sudden gust of wind, though there were no open windows, sent papers flying off the table. I felt a presence, something cold and intangible, hovering just beyond my sight. I quickly closed the book and set it back on the shelf. My unease grew, and I decided it was time to leave. As I made my way back to the main hallway, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The library seemed normal again, but the feeling of being watched lingered. When I left the building, the chill of the evening air was a relief compared to the cold that had settled in the library. I told my friends about the strange events, but most were skeptical, attributing it to my imagination or the effects of being alone in an old building. However, a few shared my sense of unease. Since that day, I've always been wary of staying alone in that library. The book and its unsettling contents remain a mystery. I've never encountered anything quite like it again, but the eerie tapping and the cold presence left an indelible mark on my memory. The old school's ghost stories now seem more plausible than ever, and sometimes I wonder if there are secrets lurking in the shadows that are better left undiscovered. It was my senior year of high school, and the school was buzzing with the usual end-of-year excitement. Graduation was just around the corner, and students were busy with preparations, final exams, and college applications. However, one evening, our typical high school routine took a turn for the eerie. I had stayed late at school to finish up some last-minute assignments in the library. The building was almost deserted by then, with only a few teachers and staff still around. By the time I packed up my things and decided to head home, the sky had turned dark, and the hallways were bathed in the dim light of flickering fluorescent bulbs. As I walked through the empty corridors, the silence was almost deafening. I took a shortcut through the old, seldom used part of the building. It was a section that housed classrooms that had been out of commission for years and was now used for storage. The air was stale, and the walls were covered in dusty old posters and outdated maps. I was halfway through this maze of forgotten rooms when I heard a soft, rhythmic thumping sound coming from one of the classrooms. At first, I thought it might be the heating system acting up, but the noise persisted, growing louder and more insistent. It was an unsettling sound, like someone was methodically tapping on the floor. My curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the sound to its source. The classroom door was slightly ajar, and the light from the hallway cast a narrow beam into the room. I pushed the door open and shone my phone's flashlight inside. The room was filled with old desks and chairs stacked haphazardly. The noise seemed to be coming from the far corner, where a large metal cabinet stood. As I approached the cabinet, the thumping grew louder, almost like a heartbeat echoing through the room. I hesitated, trying to make sense of the sound. The cabinet's doors were slightly ajar, but I couldn't see anything inside. With a deep breath, I pulled open the doors, but the noise stopped abruptly. I scanned the interior, finding nothing but old, dusty files and forgotten school supplies. My anxiety was palpable as I closed the cabinet and stepped back. That's when I noticed something strange, a faint, almost imperceptible shadow moving across the room. The shadow seemed to be shifting and undulating, as though it were alive. I tried to rationalize it as a trick of the light, but it felt wrong. I quickly left the room, my footsteps echoing loudly in the empty hallways. As I walked briskly back to the main part of the school, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. The hallways were still empty, the only sound being the soft hum of the fluorescent lights. I reached the main entrance and looked back at the old part of the school, feeling a shiver run down my spine. The thumping and shadow remained a mystery, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled upon something that was better left undisturbed. The next day, I shared my experience with a few friends. They were intrigued but skeptical, chalking it up to an overactive imagination or a malfunctioning heating system. I decided not to dwell on it, especially since the strange occurrences were isolated to that particular area of the school. In the weeks that followed, the old section of the building was closed off for renovations, and I never had a chance to revisit that classroom. The school administration announced that they were updating the facilities to make them safer and more functional, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the renovation than they let on. To this day, I'm not sure what I encountered in that abandoned classroom. Whether it was a malfunctioning old heating system, a trick of the light, or something more sinister, the experience left a lasting impression. Sometimes, the most ordinary places can hold the strangest secrets, and it's best to respect the unknown.